Australia, we need to talk about revenue. Future challenges like tackling climate change, fixing aged care, and making childcare affordable and accessible will all require more government spending. On October the 6th, the Australia Institute's Revenue Summit 2022 will bring together economists, academics, policy and taxation experts at Australian Parliament House in Canberra to discuss revenue-raising options to meet Australia's growing public spending needs. Keynote speakers include Rod Sims, former chair of the ACCC, Dr. Richard Dennis, and Sally McManus, secretary of the ACTU. Tickets are strictly limited, so head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to book your early bird ticket today and save $50.
To be clear, offsets never reduce emissions. Best case scenario, if the offsets are legit and you've offset every aspect of your business, you're treading water every year basically. So year on year, you just have to keep purchasing new offsets.
Yeah.
And if you've got 215 of the biggest emitters in Australia covering a third of our emissions just year on year buying offsets, which traditionally they have been cheap enough where you can do that, then Australia's not decarbonising at all.
We're not reducing emissions.
No, we're not reducing emissions. The word net in net zero is doing a lot of work there.
Yeah. That seems incredibly problematic.
Oh, yeah, I would have thought so, but...
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're discussing what the Labor government is going to do about climate change.
Labor's flagship emissions reduction target has been enshrined into law after passing through the Parliament.
The government's climate change bill passed the Senate, 37 votes to 30.
This day has been a long time coming.
A 43% emissions reduction target to become law.
8th of September 2022 will go down as the day that Australia's federal parliament started taking climate change seriously.
The first meaningful step in tackling climate change in over a decade.
43% target has been something of a vanity project by this Prime Minister.
A number that Anthony Albanese insists will deliver cheaper, cleaner electricity.
Jobs will go offshore and the emissions will still go into the air.
We are proud and grateful carbon-based life forms.
Climate wars are nearly over.
It's not the perfect outcome on climate, obviously, but it's a start.
Labor's climate bill cleared the Senate last week. It legislates targets for cutting emissions by at least 43% by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. It's a pretty modest bill all in all, and it doesn't actually include any measures to reduce emissions in the private sector. It really just sets the target that we're aiming for. But how do we actually get there? That's where a different policy called the safeguard mechanism comes in. It's the policy that's supposed to help us meet that 43% emissions reduction target. But what exactly is the safeguard mechanism? How does it work? More importantly, does it actually work? To dig right into these questions, I'm joined by Polly Hemming, Senior Researcher in the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Em. How you going?
Good, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Firstly, why don't you start by explaining exactly what the safeguard mechanism is? Is it a new policy?
It's not a new policy. So it's this framework that basically started under the coalition government as a way to keep an eye on Australia's biggest emitting facilities, and not only keep an eye on them, but make sure that their emissions weren't increasing, sort of out of control and eclipsing gains in other areas of the economy.
And how big are we talking here when we talk about the biggest polluters? How many of them are there, and how much of our emissions are they responsible for?
So currently it's about 215 of Australia's biggest polluters, and it's things like gas and coal. They come from all different industries, but those really polluting industries. And altogether, they're responsible for about 30% of Australia's emissions. So it's significant. You can see why the government was keen to kind of keep an eye on them and try and sort of keep in check their emissions. So to do that, to like try and make sure that they weren't going berserk, they placed caps, like pollution caps, on each of these facilities within the safeguard. That's what they're called. So they placed caps on these facilities, and if they exceeded their pollution limits, then they would have to purchase carbon credits as a way of offsetting that excess pollution. So there was never any requirement to actually reduce their emissions. It was just a way of keeping an eye on them. And actually, it didn't work very well. A majority of facilities actually negotiated with government increasing those pollution limits, saying, it would constrain us commercially if you required us to actually reduce our emissions. And so what happened is actually emissions under the safeguard mechanism by those facilities increased by 7% since 2016. So it wasn't a terribly effective policy.
Yeah, if the whole objective is to reduce emissions.
Yes, well, Angus Taylor, when asked about this, actually said, well, no, sorry, the safeguard was never intended to reduce emissions. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how he rationalised that, but either way, it worked, didn't reduce emissions.
And net zero means that we can still have an agriculture sector. We're still going to have gas as an important part of the mix for many, many years to come. And that's appropriate because you simply can't wipe these industries out, Lee.
In recognition of that, Labor has said that, okay, if we left these facilities to just keep, operating unfettered, business as usual, then emissions from the industrial sector of Australia would actually become our biggest source of emissions. It would eclipse all other polluting sectors like energy and transport together.
So how is Labor proposing to keep a lid on or reduce emissions from this sector by changing the safeguards mechanism?
So you know how I was talking about those caps, those pollution limits, and they're yet to work out whether they do this across industries or between individual facilities. But what they're going to do is say, okay, you've got that cap. Every year to 2030, you are going to have to reduce your emissions. So you're going to have to find ways within your business or through buying offsets to not only stay under that existing pollution limit, you're going to have to plan for next year when it is ratcheted down. So the idea is that
every year the cap gets lower.
Every year the cap gets lower. And I think as a whole, the whole safeguard reduces its collective emissions by 5 million tonnes every year. It's not even how it's done that, but government will work out, who and how reduces their emissions year on year.
Yeah.
In theory.
What happens if you go over the cap, Polly?
You have to buy carbon credits. So basically nothing really. You buy carbon credits and that theoretically, it costs you money, and that theoretically offsets, in inverted commas, that excess as if it never happened.
Okay.
Finally, what's your view of this safeguard mechanism review? It's a very complex area of policy, obviously, dealing with 215 of the heaviest emitters.
There's two ways to do it. Change what you do, or you buy credits to cover what you can't.
I think the commitment to continuing the safeguard mechanism in some form is important.
But there's less incentive to cut processes or products that pollute when prices are low. Companies can simply buy their way out with credits.
The safeguard mechanism is an incredibly complicated and I would say unnecessarily complex framework or policy. It's a kind of a Frankenstein sort of policy in that it came out of a policy that already existed under the coalition, which in itself came out of another policy, and now Labor's using this policy that was a policy and has kind of like added bits, mashed bits together. So it's kind of like a dodgy home renovation or something. And
so before we even start, it's kind of a bit of a Frankenstein's beast.
Exactly. And the why I want to say that is because Labor is using it as a climate policy because it was there, not necessarily because it is the best policy. And also because it's incredibly complicated and a lot of people don't know what it is, let alone how it works. And I just want to point out that it's actually okay if people are very confused by it, because it's this beast of a thing. So if people
it's
are
not designed to be simple,
it's
or
not designed to be
understandable.
simple, and if people get confused by it, that's okay. That's not your fault. That's a failure either to communicate what it is, or it's unnecessarily complex. So
Up until now, you've really seen industry voluntarily taking a lot of action around reducing their emissions. The review and the tightening of the safeguard mechanism is going to bring around that compliance driver and really begin to push industry.
So it's not working at the moment. Walk me through how Labor's intending to change it, that ratchet mechanism that you were talking about. So have we overblown all of the emissions because this was a voluntary scheme where people, like, what went wrong with it? How come emissions exploded?
Yeah, well, what went wrong is that there was no requirement to reduce emissions, but the whole premise of it was based on emissions intensity. So just say you had a coal mine that was captured by the safeguard mechanism, so it had this pollution limit on it. It could say to the government, look, we will reduce the CO2 or the carbon per tonne of coal we produce, but we can't be hindered commercially, like you can't stop us operating. So sure, we'll reduce the emissions intensity of each tonne of coal, but we're going to produce more coal because we need that to be profitable. So yes, we have this limit that you've put on us, but they're what were called production adjusted. So then the government would say, yeah, okay, fair cop, we don't want to hinder your commercial viability. We will increase that limit for you. So
companies are expanding, making more emissions, and the government's like, no worries, we'll just lift that limit.
We'll just change the limit. So it was actually very rare that facilities did even hit the limit. Like they would quite often overblow or overinflate what they said they were going to be producing. So they'd have this super high pollution limit, knowing that they would quite easily come in underneath it.
And never have to actually reduce
and
emissions.
There was never any requirement to even reduce them. If you exceeded that threshold, all you'd have to do is buy offsets anyway. And the previous government, when asked about this, said, oh, well, the safeguard was never meant to reduce emissions anyway. It was...
What did they say it was for then?
Yeah, exactly. So actually, in its original design, it was meant to ensure that business as usual didn't kind of eclipse what was happening in other areas of the economy where reductions were being made. Some pretty tricky language there.
So I feel like that's all talking about what's gone wrong with the safeguards mechanism.
Yeah.
Labor is going further than the former coalition government on climate change. It's promising to cut carbon emissions by 43% this decade from 2005 levels. 215 of Australia's biggest industrial polluters will be forced to negotiate with the Clean Energy Regulator about how they meet this target.
So now we've got a new Labor government. It's got a 43% emissions reduction target. How is it going to change this inoperative, not working safeguards mechanism to actually reduce emissions?
Yeah, so it's in consultation now exactly how this will work, but big picture, the government has said we will require the facilities captured under the safeguard as a whole to reduce their emissions, I think it's by 5 million tonnes each year going forward to 2030. So the safeguard is actually quite a small part of Labor's policy. It's the one sort of everyone talks about, I think, because it's the most controversial. But Labor is anticipating majority of its reductions come from renewable energy, and then there's this safeguard mechanism that is meant to reduce its emissions from that 137 million tonnes that I talked about in 2021 down to 99 million tonnes by 2030. So a gradual reduction. Having said that, there's already, without sort of working through those finer details, there's already several, I would say, significant red flags that suggest maybe is not going to be as effective as the government is suggesting that it's going to be.
Okay. What are some of those?
Some of those are the fact that this is sort of what everyone's talking about, because the government has obviously refused to rule out new gas and coal development in Australia. Labor's been asked repeatedly about this, but initially when asked, Minister Bowen said there's no need for a moratorium on gas and coal, as some people have been calling for, because the safeguard mechanism will take care of that.
sending the message to investors that Australia's open for business.
Then when pushed again, Labor said, oh, well, no, new gas and coal facilities in Australia would be captured under the safeguard mechanism and required to reduce their emissions, which is still confusing because it's still adding new emissions into the system. So
presumably if you open 10 new coal mines, how do we reduce our emissions?
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
How does that work? Or you're basically saying it doesn't work.
Well, yes, that's the biggest issue. Like there's no point in even kind of prosecuting all these little technicalities within the safeguard because the International Energy Agency has said if governments are serious about the climate crisis, you need to not have any more investment in gas and coal, full stop, that's it.
If we're going to listen to climate scientists, if we're going to listen to the International Energy Agency, they've been so clear that we cannot afford to open up new coal and gas projects.
In the month between this bill passing the House of Representatives to this first day when it's now being debated in the Senate, the Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, has released 10 new oil and gas leases covering 47,000 square kilometres of our ocean.
Prime Minister, the federal government is now being asked to approve one of the 114 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline. Will the government block this new coal project, including by putting a climate trigger in our environment laws? Or will Labor keep opening new coal and gas projects because, as your Resources Minister outrageously said, it's just, quote, the bubbles in your soda stream. We've got to keep it in balance how we think about carbon dioxide.
The Australia Institute basically did research last year showing that we have around 114, I think the number is now 116 new gas and coal projects in development. In their entirety, the emissions from those onshore would be about 150 million tonnes every year. Then we took a handful of just projects that are actually on the table now, like some of those projects in development obviously won't come to fruition. But if you look at like several projects like the Narrabri coal mining expansion, Narrabri coal seam gas, the Scarborough Pluto project and Woodside's Northwest Shelf expansion, the emissions from them alone onshore would be about 114 million tonnes from now to 2030. So there is no way of reconciling new gas and coal being managed by the safeguard mechanism. Like it's just going to blow it all out of the water. It will blow 43% out of the water, and the government has not been able to answer, how you can justify new gas and coal.
So, Polly, you've just talked about the fact that the safeguards mechanism doesn't factor in new gas and coal, which is going to blow out the target. What are some of the other problems with the safeguard mechanism that Labor is proposing?
So another really significant problem is the fact that, okay, you've got these facilities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism. Essentially what's happening is they're being collectively all being given a carbon budget, and it's up to the government to kind of work out who has to reduce what to stay within that carbon budget, if that makes sense. Like you've got all your kids and one punnet of ice cream. You're going to allocate it out evenly, but bigger kids will get more and stuff. But you have to stay within that amount that you're allocated. It's really unclear how, just say we have a new gas or coal or any other kind of industrial development in Australia, really high emitting project in Australia, how that will factor into that emissions budget within the safeguard. So if you have a new project starting and then that is kind of captured by this framework where they're being required to reduce their emissions or offset their emissions, and you've got like a discrete carbon budget, how does that work? Does that mean this new project starts up and then they're allocated a bit of that budget
and everyone else has to do more?
Well, exactly. It's like the remember that kid's song 10 in the bed and little ones
yeah.
that then another one gets in or whatever. Is everyone going to have to do more? Or are other sectors of the economy now going to have to do more because we're letting, say, the biggest polluters in Australia keep expanding? Yeah. That's really complicated by the fact that the government is cutting slack to some of the highest emitting facilities under the safeguard.
So we've got the safeguards mechanism.
Yep.
Problem number one,
Yep.
new gas and coal.
Yep.
shouldn't really be allowed under this, but it looks like it's going to be. Problem number 2 is there's only a certain pie.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to let new people in, and it's not clear how that impacts the rest of the people that are already under the umbrella of the safeguards mechanism. And now we've got a new problem, which is how we actually treat these new entrants, so to speak.
Exactly,
and carve-outs, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Thank you for breaking it down like that. It's really easy to just sort of reel off this like a shopping list of and another thing, but you're right. Yes, carve-outs, basically. The government's very keen to support industry in Australia. Like, it's very keen to support business and doesn't want to be seen to be hindering productivity in Australia. So we have these categories called emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries in Australia. And what that means is that they're really dirty, basically. And they operate internationally.
And they operate internationally
and they export, yeah. So if we were to, burden them with having to actually take responsibility for their emissions, that might incur costs, and it would be harder for them to trade, like to keep their profit margins high.
The idea being that other countries might not necessarily have the same emissions reductions targets as we do, so they've got a competitive advantage is the idea,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. So there is potentially, again, we don't know how this will work, but there's potentially carve-outs where, say, facilities who meet that category, which is predominantly gas and coal, really. There's a whole list of what we call these IETs, but they're potentially going to have high baselines, or they'll get given like carbon credits for free that they can just use as offsets. We don't know how they will be treated. And again, does that mean everyone else is going to have to do more work as a result, or are we just going to not worry about the increased emissions from them?
Those are some pretty big flaws that seem like it's going to be really hard for Labor to achieve its 43% emissions reduction target. But there's other elements that make this a little bit concerning as well.
You as a passenger want to fly carbon neutral today? The best way is to voluntarily carbon offset your flights. This is the most...
And you mentioned offsets in there, that under the previous government, and it doesn't look like it will change under this government, that if you, by some miracle, reach your excessively generous cap on emissions and, you're going to go over that, then you can just buy offsets. How does that work?
That's right. So even though they're kind of working out these finer details, the government put out a consultation paper for people to respond to say, how do you think this should work? And they've already said in that consultation paper, facilities or entities can purchase offsets as an alternative to reducing emissions. So, you basically just buy carbon credits and say someone's planted a tree over here, therefore I don't actually have to do anything structurally within my business to reduce emissions. Someone else has done the work for me. I can keep emitting business as usual. And, that raises a whole new suite of problems. The first one being that if there's no actual requirement to reduce emissions, what's going to happen year on year? To be clear, offsets never reduce emissions. Best case scenario, if the offsets are legit and you've offset every aspect of your business, you're treading water every year basically. So year on year, you just have to keep purchasing new offsets.
Yeah.
And if you've got 215 of the biggest emitters in Australia covering a third of our emissions just year on year buying offsets, which traditionally they have been cheap enough where you can do that, then Australia's not decarbonising at all.
We're not reducing emissions.
No, we're not reducing emissions. No, there's a lot of that. The word net in net zero is doing a lot of work there.
Yeah. That seems incredibly problematic
to me. Oh, yeah, I would have thought so. But
let's be clear. The goal here is net zero. This is a very important point. Now, if your goal is absolute zero, you want to wipe out any industry with any emissions. That means agriculture. That means mining. That means fossil fuels. They've all got to go. Our goal is net zero.
Not all industries can decarbonise in the same time frame. That's recognised, and what we have to do is put the investment to allow industries that it's more difficult in to get there as fast as possible.
All right, so we've got flaws in the scheme.
Yep.
Then we've got the issue of offsets. Partly that's a problem because there's no actual reduction in emissions. At best, that's just the status quo. But You've spoken to us in the past on the podcast, Polly, about dodgy offsets, the fact that there's a lack of integrity in our carbon credit scheme.
Yeah. Most of our offsets are baloney. And if industry is just buying offsets, a lot of our offsets in Australia, which I'll get to, are from the land sector. So basically what that's doing, if industry just buys offsets, is other people are having to do the work to generate those offsets. And it's potentially in agriculture, which is a genuinely hard to abate sector, they're going to have to find their own reductions because they're trying to meet Australia's climate targets, an economy-wide target.
Yeah.
So it's not like printing monopoly money, or it's not like printing money. Like, those offsets have to come from somewhere. So the burden is placed on other sectors. But yes, as you say, those offsets that are coming from the land sector currently, the Australia Institute has found, and other academics have found, including Professor McIntosh from the ANU and his colleagues, found that up to 75% of Australia's carbon credits have low integrity, so they're not reducing emissions. So
3/4.
3/4, yeah. So it's incredibly problematic that already, we went from earlier, we were talking about what's happened under the safeguard. So while it was rare that polluters actually met their pollution limits, sometimes they did and they had to buy carbon credits, but they've been buying carbon credits that are potentially nothing. So the result has been a net increase in emissions. So if you have offsets that are not real, and you have carbon credits that are not real and they're being used as offsets, basically nothing is being offset and emissions are increasing. Yeah. So in recognition of the fact that the work by the Australia Institute and others showed that there's just such manifest problems with the integrity of our carbon credits, Labor, to its credit, announced a review of this scheme, which is underway currently, where they look at these three biggest methods and some other aspects of the scheme. But what is really alarming is that review, the findings of that review, will be handed over to the government by Professor Ian Chubb in December. All this stuff we've just been talking about with the safeguard, that is in development now, and draft legislation for that will be presented in November. So they are developing an entire kind of offsetting scheme, I guess, industry offsetting scheme, without waiting for the results to find out whether our offsets are even legit, completely the wrong way round. And have already said no requirement to reduce, you can buy offsets. It's as if this review isn't even happening.
Yeah. Oh.
An environmental market without integrity is not an environmental market, it's a rort. And I feel that Australia's carbon market is just that. It's degenerated to become a rort.
To sum up, the safeguard sounds like it's just safeguarding polluters.
There's a number of red flags to suggest that might be the case. Yeah, that's the risk. Yeah.
So, Polly, just summarise again for us some of the key flaws with the safeguards mechanism as it's currently proposed.
So you've got this situation where emissions from industry are rising. Government has said we're going to try and reduce those emissions from industry, but we're also going to allow new fossil fuel developments in Australia. We're also going to have carve-outs for really high-emitting industries. We're not quite sure what other facilities will have to do if we allow new high-emitting industries. We don't know if others will have to do more or other sectors will have to do more. And regardless of all that, anyone just has to offset their emissions. They don't actually have to reduce them.
And some of those offsets, and quite a large number of those offsets, might be dodgy.
Yes. So it's very hard to see when you kind of sum it up like that. It's very hard to see how effective this safeguard will actually be.
Yeah, not much of a safe or a guard in there. More just a mechanism, shall we say.
It is time to put a price on carbon, to phase out fossil fuel finance and then fossil fuel subsidies, to stop building new coal power plants and halt coal power financing domestically and overseas.
When we are talking about the global level emission, which is what is driving global temperature, what is driving sea level to rise, it is not whether you export it or burn it at home. It's got to be, it's the total aggregate that it's about the global level of emission, including both domestic emissions and those which you export as a country from which you derive revenue and benefits.
On the one hand, it's great that the Albanese government has, I think, prioritised this legislation for the 43% reduction target. It gives us where we want to go. This seems like it's going to actually make it quite hard for us to get there. What are some of the things that they could do to either improve the safeguards mechanism or actually reduce emissions? Just quickly. Obviously, you don't have to resolve Australia's climate policy problems in the next
I'm going to do
minute
it. It sounds like a challenge. Right? I've got 60 seconds
But yeah,
left.
what are some of the key things that we could do to actually fix this a bit?
We do what the science is telling us, and even international organisations like the International Energy Agency and the UN are telling us, hey, no new gas and coal. No one is saying we stop using fossil fuels today. No one is, it's disingenuous for anyone to suggest that. We're saying stop developing them.
Just stop.
Climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels. So stop burning fossil fuels in the future. Plan that phase out. That would take care of so much of this, like these elaborate mechanisms to kind of get around that. The other thing is actually mandate reductions. You can do that. You know, there used to be a policy called polluter pays, and that's actually still written into some state laws in Australia. It is okay to say you have to reduce your emissions and reduce them, don't offset them. You know, offsets are meant as a means of last resort, but they seem to be, everyone wants to be the net in Australia. No one is prepared to be the zero, and the net is offsets. There are policies that could be an alternative to the safeguard. A lot of people have written about, you know, in direct industrial incentives and things like that, and actually working with sectors to reduce emissions and in investing that. You know, we give $11 billion in subsidies to fossil fuels every year. That's a big chunk of money that could be diverted to decarbonisation in Australia.
And just doing it directly.
Just doing it directly, yeah, absolutely. Doing it directly, whether it's farmers or industry, or doing it directly is much more efficient. Regulating and incentivising, but doing it directly.
Yeah. Well, I think we've solved climate change, Polly. But at the very least, I think it's really helpful for people to know it is extremely complicated. If you don't understand it, that's not on you. It is just complicated and probably designed that way so that people don't really understand.
Yeah,
or pay
absolutely.
attention to what's happening.
Yes, you've just said it. It is incredibly complicated, and actually, that's a failing, I think, on our leaders to not clearly communicate policy.
And the more complicated something is, the more chance you have to stuff it up. Simple things that are easy to understand, easy to be held accountable for.
Well, you could say it's by design. Good policy is usually very easy. Some might say good policy is usually very easy to communicate. It's funny that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your time, Polly, and for digging into the weeds on this one, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about the safeguards mechanism. But yeah, it's just, I think it's not very clear what it is or how the government's going to change it. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Em.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 14th of September 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest climate research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Polly Hemming is at Polly J Hemming. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPeak from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.